Hello and welcome back to Agile Project Management 101, running meetings for a Scrum sprint. We're going to discuss what is typically the first meeting in a given sprint. If you remember from the previous video, a sprint is a short iteration of work that includes specific tasks to complete within a time frame. And these tasks are called stories. Typically, a sprint is 1 to 4 weeks long, and as such, our plan for the sprint should really match what we can complete within that amount of time. So what are the components of a sprint planning meeting? The first component is a sprint goal. Now this is defined by the product owner. In essence, this is the individual or individuals that decide the direction of the product. The goal can be a theme such as improving application stability, a category of stories such as functions relating to user management, for example, or a more vague idea like building a solid foundation for future application development. Regardless of the type of goal, this should influence the choices made in sprint planning and in the sprint planning meetings, and should be shared multiple times with all attendees and participants in a given sprint. The next component of sprint planning is the backlog, and this is the list of stories or tasks to be completed. Again, reiterating from the previous video, the backlog is like a wish list with individual stories comprising the entirety of it. Stories, on the other hand, are the refined components to be completed. They're called stories as they're meant to be more descriptive than prescriptive. And what that means is that a story is supposed to explain what should happen, not necessarily how it should happen. For example, if the software should allow for users to save a shopping item for future viewing, the story does not usually detail the code and technical architecture of what's required to allow this function. Instead, a story has 3 simple sentences to start out with. 1, as a category of user. 2, I want to perform some task or have a specific request. 3, so that I can achieve some goal or outcome. So the previous example would be, as a shopping user, I want to save an item for later viewing so that I can assess my various choices when purchasing an item. Now this format includes the audience, the action or request, and the business reasoning behind it. It keeps the development team and the stakeholders in line and on the same page without getting too in the weeds on the details. After this is defined, the next piece of the story really depends on the organization and group completing work. It also depends on the story itself and the size of the story. In some instances, the 3 sentences are enough to begin development, and in other situations, details may go all the way up to high-fidelity prototypes that are created prior to beginning development. Detailed heuristics of requirements defining are subject to the situation itself and can be very complex. As such, they are out of the scope for this course. Now that we've defined some of the components, let's add more context to the sprint planning meeting. So who should really be included in this meeting? You, the project manager or scrum master, to use a scrum term, should be included. Stakeholders that are representative of the entire group of stakeholders should be included. That is to say, if a group that has influence or stake in the project or product is not represented by at least one person, you should remedy that and invite someone who represents that group. Typically, developers that are working on the stories will attend as well. But if your organization has managers for developers, they can be included along with the developers or in place of the developers. Product owners, or again, the individuals responsible for deciding the direction of the product, should also be included, as they usually have the final say. Now that we have the components and the attendees for the sprint planning meeting, where do we begin planning? Well, the best place to start is with the sprint capacity. And this refers to the cumulative and individual hours available in the sprint for development. Typically, this is a 40-hour work week per developer, And most teams include a 10 to 20% buffer in capacity for the total and for the individual hours. So if we are considering a 40-hour work week, a buffer of 8 hours is common, leaving a realized capacity of 32 hours for the individual in the game. Don't forget to factor in time off and holidays, as this would affect the realized capacity. After defining the capacity, the stakeholders will typically give feedback on priorities, with the product owner making the ultimate call of what to include while also considering that capacity that we just referred to. Some organizations will often assign developers to estimate the time the individual stories will take prior to the meeting in order to speed up the meeting planning. Other organizations may ask developers to assess the stories and get the estimates added to the sprint during the sprint planning meeting. And again, these time estimates are going to be used to measure against the capacity for the meeting. So again, if we are referring to our previous example of a 40-hour work week with an 8-hour buffer for a realized capacity of 32 hours for one developer, then stories that total 32 hours can be included in a sprint if the sprint is a single week. Another common practice of story estimation is called t-shirt sizing. T-shirt sizing uses a completed story where time has been tracked as a baseline. This story is defined as a medium t-shirt size for developers to refer to and define stories as either small, medium, or large relative to that baseline story in order to estimate how long they think the story will take and how difficult it can be. So, for example, a baseline story may be 4 hours and require resources from 2 different developers. Now, a story that would be 8 hours may be called a large t-shirt size then, based off of that baseline. Now, this can be a complex technique and maybe a little bit ambiguous at times. Now, this can be a pro and a con, but in this course, we're going to be referring to what is called direct hours estimation. So if a story has been estimated, the developer will say exactly how many hours they think this will take. Once the priorities have been defined and the stories have been moved from the backlog to the sprint to the assigned individuals or developers based on the capacity, the sprint planning meeting can be concluded.